All right, folks, we're going to move into the second part of ancient Greece, and we're going to start off on figure 5-7, where we were looking at the Kouros sculpture. Remember, we're in the Archaic period, and this period is from 600 to 480 BCE. In this Archaic period is you're going to see the development of the use of the Egyptian canons that are going to be more prominent in the sculptures. We're also going to see the development of the architectural temples starting to take off, very specifics in regards to the architecture and the engineering of these temples. And we're also going to see pottery, the use of pottery. So we're going to begin with the figure 5-7, and that again is the Kouros sculpture. And you can see again the Egyptian canons that are present, like I mentioned at the end of the last video. Leg forward, simple shapes, geometric shapes within the anatomy of the body, symmetry, arms down to the side, and the archaic smile, hence the Archaic period. And then there will be some subtle Mesopotamian elements like the pattern in the hair as well as the wider eyes. So when you see this Kouros sculpture, you should know that this is going to be the beginnings of the Archaic period. Then in figure 5-9, you're going to see the development and the voluminous nature of the anatomy of the form starting to develop over just about 70 years. And that's the Krosios. And in the Krosios, you can see very similar elements that are present in the Kouros sculpture, but we have more of a rounded, cylinder, voluminous-like shape. So the Greeks are slowly approaching their classical period, which is around 480 to 400 BCE. And this Krosios is the standing youthful male sculpture that is indicating to us that they're slowly moving into the elements of what is really important to the classical Greek art, and going to slowly be removing those Egyptian and Mesopotamian standards and canons from the sculptural aspects. But you can still see here that we do have those Egyptian elements, those Egyptian canons. You have the leg moving forward. You also have the arms down to the side, the symmetry. You have still the very simplistic mathematical geometric shapes being used within the anatomy of figure 5-9 Krosios. But it's more detailed. I don't want to say it's more natural or realistic, because the Greeks at this time, as they move into the classical period, are not going to focus on naturalism or realism, because they're trying to develop a system like an algorithm, if you will, within the anatomy of the male body, to indicate again their sense of order and rationality and logic over sense gratification, emotions, and irrationality. So the body is not necessarily natural, it's more of an ideal form. IDEAL, or idyllic, IDL, IDYLIC, idyllic. So it's more about using the body as like a mathematical formula, and that's what they're going to do. And you can see with figure 5-9, the leg stepping forward, arms down to the side, those simple shapes and simple patterns throughout the body, but it's definitely more detailed. And it's more rounded, and it's less blocky. So they're definitely shifting away from the Egyptian canons. The right leg is pivoted up at an angle, which is indicating that they're getting more true to detailed posture throughout human stance. But there's still an element of disproportion, meaning that the lower body is much longer in relation to the proportions of the upper body. Almost like it's two different sculptures that have been put together right there in the center or in the pelvic area. So they're still developing the proper proportions on how the legs look in relation to the upper body, and vice versa. So that is going to become a very important technicality whenever it comes to the classical period, which will follow the Archaic period. All right, we still have the braided hair and the wide eyes, which is very similar to Mesopotamia. And then back to the Egyptian standard, you still have that archaic smile. So that's what lets us know that we're still within that archaic period. But I want you to be able to look at figure 5-7 and 5-9 and see the development that they're starting to do in regards to detail of the figure, and slowly starting to shift away from the Egyptian canons. That also will be present in figure 510 in the peplos kore. And the kore, K-O-R-E, is youthful girl, and the koros is youthful boy. So kore is the equivalent or counterpart to the koros, or the koros is the counterpart and equivalent to the kore. So at the same time, in parallel, they're running youthful girl sculptures as well as youthful boy sculptures. And again, it's supposed to indicate these ideal forms that they're trying to develop for order and control. And what they're doing in particular with the peplos kore is they're really going to develop the garment and that organic drapery. And they're going to heavily focus on organic drapery when it comes to the feminine form. And then they're going to focus more on the muscularity and the control of kind of mathematical Cartesian coordinate planes like parabolas and hyperboles, and very directive lines and very important shapes that you would find in a graphing element of geometry with the male figure. And then with the female figure, they're going to keep the shape pretty cylinder-like, very much like we saw with the Egyptians. And they're going to focus more on the organic drapery for a while, and then all that's going to start to change and shift once those Grecian Peloponnesian wars start to develop and start to influence the emotions of the Greeks during the high classical period. But here you can see that there is an opening in her arm on the left, and that's really important because this is our first indicator of modular construction, modular sculpture. In the past, it's been modeling with one material compounded on itself to design something, or you have the material and you chisel it away, and that's called relief, or you've made something with wax and you substituted it with molten metal, either copper or bronze, and that's a substitution process. And let me go back, and the carving of the stone is a subtractive process. And now in this case, we have 98% of the figure done with one piece of marble that's been carved, and then there's going to be a secondary piece of marble, which would be our left front arm, that would be interlocking in that open circle. And that's what we call modular construction. All right, so like construction of a home is modular parts put together, assembled, and then it holds up an ultimate form. And that's what's happening here with the peplos kore. All right, so it's a new form of sculpting, and it's called modular. Another thing that I do want to mention, I want to go back to the organic drapery. You can see that it even looks like she has a couple different layers of clothing on her upper body, which is developing this layered element of organic drapery. And also there's an attempt at pleating on the lower part of her garment, which is going to start developing, becoming more and more exaggerated and more detail-oriented as we move into the classical period. Her hair is still draped down to the side and symmetrical, and even like we saw with the Mesopotamians, her eyes are slightly widened, but they're starting to narrow down quite a bit, which means we're moving away from that Mesopotamian standard and that influence coming from there. She does still have that archaic smile, so that lets us know that we're in that archaic period. So like I said, during this time we're also going to have the development and the rise and advent of very important temples. And there's going to be three main types of, or I should say styles, like garment styles, three different styles of temples, and then based off of the columns, and then there's going to be two different types of column orders. So what I'm going to need you to look at is figure 512 and 513, and we'll start with 512. And it's an aerial plan of a temple that has columns all the way around it on the outside perimeter. And whenever there's columns all the way around, and there's continuous columns, like there's more than one and there becomes two and more than that, That's what we call a colonnade. A colonnade is a series of 2 or more columns lined up together. It's called a colonnade. So you need to look at the outer colonnade of the structure, and that'll let you know what style it is. And with figure 512, with all the little circles all the way around, that's an aerial view of where the columns were, where those colonnades are. And when they're all the way around, it's called a peristyle. P-E-R-I-S-T-Y-L-E. Peristyle. All the way around. When you have a temple structure and the colonnade is only in the front of the temple, that's called a pro-style. P-R-O-S-T-Y-L-E. Pro-style. When you have a temple that has a colonnade in the front and in the back, that's called an amphiprostyle. A-M-P-H-I-P-R-O-S-T-Y-L-E. Amphiprostyle. Like an amphibian, right? It has dual functions. It has a dual entrance. It can be in the water or it can be on land. You can enter through the front or you can enter through the back. And then a peristyle is all the way around, like a periscope that goes at 360 degrees. You can enter anywhere around the whole structure. So wherever the colonnades are, that's a place of entrance. And then a prostyle means in the front. A pro is always in the front of the line. The professional is in the front. The pro star is in the front. The professional athlete is always the first to play. They're in the front of the line. So pro style means you're entering only from the front. So those are your 3 styles. And I want you to go all the way back at the PowerPoint and look at figure 5.1, and you're going to see the Parthenon. And I want you to be able to discuss why it's a certain style and it's going to be a certain order. So just prepare for that, because I'm going to ask you that on the 2nd week. So just review figure 1.5 whenever it comes to what style it is and then what order it's going to be. Now what I mean by order is figure 5.13. And you'll see 2 different diagrams. You'll see a Doric order and an Ionic order. And whenever you're first looking at a temple, an image, you need a beeline right to the middle of this figure 3.13. And you'll see the columns. And the columns are different. One column, the Doric order, has no base to it. It's right above the steps or the stylobate. And right above those steps or that stylobate is where the column begins. And then that shaft of that column goes up to what's called the capital. And you can see that the capital has a very general shape. It's a very general square or like a rectangle. It's more of a square actually. All right? And that's what lets you know that it's a Doric order. Versus the Ionic order, you go to the stylobate or the steps of entrance to the temple, and it goes up to a base. And the Ionic column has a base. And then it rises up the shaft to the capital, and you can see the capital is way more ornate. And it has 2 spirals on the end. When you see that capital with the spirals, then that temple is an Ionic order. It's an Ionic temple. And then depending on where those columns are, either the Ionic column or the Doric column, all the way around, which would be a peristyle, or in front, a prostyle, or in front and back, which would be an amphiprostyle. So that's what I mean by style and order. In figure 5.13, I also want you to know what the frieze is and how the frieze is different between the Doric order and the Ionic order, and then also what's called the pediment. Those are the 3 main areas I want you to know. You're going to look at the columns to know what order it is. You're going to look at the friezes and see their differences, and then you'll see that the pediments are similar. And the pediments are like an isosceles triangle, typically on the eastern and western fronts, the eastern and western sides of the temple. Now with the friezes, you'll see that there is a difference in the Doric and Ionic. And there's a couple, this is why these PowerPoints are important, because the book fails to include certain words for the Doric order. And you'll see, look, find the frieze, and you'll see there are two more red lines right of the frieze. And it's the first one on the top is supposed to say triglyph. Triglych. Triglyph. The second line under that is supposed to be metopede. Metope. A Doric order on its frieze will be a combination of triglyphs and metopedes. The triglyph will be those three vertical lines that breaks up the metopede, which will be a relief sculpture. So it will go triglyph, relief sculpture called a metopede, triglyph, relief sculpture called a metopede, triglyph, so on and so forth, all the way around the frieze of the temple. Versus the Ionic order will have a frieze that will be a continuous relief sculpture all the way around the temple. There will be no triglyphs. And because there's no triglyphs on an Ionic order temple, there's no metopedes. It's just a continuous frieze. So be able to know the difference between those two. And also know that within the friezes, those sculptures are going to be relief sculptures. And in the pediment, they're going to start off with relief sculptures, but then they're going to start creating freestanding sculptures that will stand inside of the pediment. So if you look at figure 516, it's a relief sculpture of a pediment. All right, a relief sculpture that would go inside of the pediment. And the title is The West Pediment in the Temple of Artemis. All right. And this is a relief sculpture that was placed on the western side of the temple. Like I said, the pediments were often on the east where the sun rises and on the west where the sun sets. And this is a relief sculpture of the west pediment of the Temple of Artemis. This is a very specific type of relief that they're going to develop more and more. This type of relief is called high relief. What we saw in the Paleolithic and Neolithic and even into ancient Mesopotamia, the relief sculptures were low relief, low. But the Greeks are going to develop high relief. And what that means is half to 3/4 of the image is going to be carved out where it looks super three-dimensional from the block of stone, in this case limestone, that it's been chiseled out of. So when you see it, it looks as if it's fully disengaged from the limestone, but a quarter to half of it is still engaged in the limestone. It's not fully disengaged, meaning disengaged means like in the round. When something's completely disengaged, that means you could walk around it or look around it 360 degrees. But that's not what high relief is. High relief is half of it is carved out and rounded over, or 3/4 of it is cut out and rounded over. So the west pediment in figure 516 of the Temple of Artemis is an example of a high relief pediment sculpture. All right. Now what I'll do is I'll do just a little bit more in this video, and then we'll go in and stop it because I want to talk about a new technique that's not in the book either. And that's on figure 517, the restored view of the Siphnian treasury. And if you look at the columns in the front, this is a pro-style temple because the colonnade is in the front. There's no colonnade in the back, there's none on the side, so it's pro-style. You can see the pediment on the top, and you can see the frieze going all the way around underneath the pediment. This is not an Ionic temple though, and it's not because of the columns. Those two columns are not Ionic capitals. They are not Ionic orders. They are not Doric orders either. They are very special. This type of colonnade is called a caryatid. It's not in the book. It's well, we're not using it anyway. You're using these lectures. This is why, one of the reasons why. It's carytids, caryatids. So when you see a column that's completely carved out with a figurative narrative on them, that's called a caryatid. So this restored view of the Semphian treasury is a very special treasury. It's a very special structure. It's not Ionic, it's not Doric, and it is pro-style, and it has caryatid columns. So be able to know that. And then in the next video, I'll start off with the frieze of the treasury, and that's where we'll begin as we move into the classical period of Greece. All right, see you soon.